So, welcome everyone to our lecture series of the ERA Chair in e-governance and digital public services. This lecture series is a regular event where we try to discuss current topics and also work in our network of esteemed colleagues and provide them access to new developments, as well as also our students possibilities to ask questions and the other way around. So as today we have a particular honor to welcome Carsten Schürmann, who is a professor of computer science at the IT University in Copenhagen, where he heads the Center for Information Security and Trust. And next to his work in the academic sphere, he actually uses his knowledge to transfer that to practice. And he has been a consultant to governmental and non-governmental organizations around voting and election technology. As such, he has also worked as a senior election expert for the OSCE ODIHR and has been a member of several election observation missions, including to Kenya in 2017 with the Carter Center, the United States in 2018 with OSCE ODIHR, and Estonia as well with the OSCE ODIHR. Prior to moving to Denmark, Carsten was a member of the computer science faculty at Yale University in the United States, and he holds a PhD degree from Carnegie Mellon University. Without further ado, Carsten, I would like you to start your presentation. And if it's up to you if you want to take questions immediately or you want to have them at the end, but that's really up to you.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much, Robert, for this very nice introduction. Indeed, I've been working on both ends. I have been working on the cryptographic end. I've been working on the trust angle and trust end of elections. And I have also tried to actually translate this into practice. And what I want to talk about today is I want to actually just give a little bit of an overview and share a little bit my experiences of participating in a mission to Kenya. And that gave me firsthand information about what kind of challenges do developing and post-conflict countries actually face when they kind of hold elections and when they try to kind of solve some of the fundamental problems of trust with technology. And so this is why I'm talking about election technologies and trust elections. I should also say that I am not talking about all of these opinions that I'm uttering today. They're all my personal opinions, and it has nothing. I'm not reflecting any public statement of the Carter Center mission to Kenya in 2017. So other people have done this. The interesting part is actually there is going to be an election this year again. So what is actually the big challenge in an election? And let's see if I can get to the next slide. Yeah, so the big challenge is how do you actually convince the loser to accept the outcome of the election? So elections work, the technology, that is not the technology, but this is actually one of the big challenges of organizing elections. And I think before electronic stuff came along, humanity has kind of found a rather nice paper-based system on actually has refined it over many years, 50 to 100 years. And, elections came out that in some countries have demonstrated that people actually trust it, no matter if they voted for the loser and or the winner. But now comes technology. So, one hears sometimes that, we have a problem with the trust in our country. Why don't we use technology in order to solve those? And, indeed, technology can actually work pretty well, but it is very difficult to get the technology right so that it actually does what it wants. So these might be completely benign mistakes in software or hardware or in the processes that one has to kind of set up in order to do this. The second challenge is that election technologies, internet voting, or any kind of technology runs actually in an adversarial environment. So that means that there might be people out there to kind of attack or change the election outcome or change it to their own favorite party. But it's not only that they actually really doing it, it is also the perception of that this could actually be done, which is problematic. Which kind of can lead to disinformation, and it can lead to a lot of challenges when it comes actually to building trust. And the other challenge is when you are living in polarized societies. So now we've noticed that the US is moving more and more into a polarized societies where there are two parties and they don't actually support each other very well. And especially in those kind of societies, the adversarial environment and all of the challenges that come along with these technologies are problematic. So, yeah, how do we do this? And what are actually the real challenges? So here I have painted to the left the US ballot. And the challenge with the US ballot is there are many races on one ballot. There are many different jurisdictions, so the ballots don't look the same. There are 10,000 different jurisdictions in the United States. And when people vote, they vote on different races. And that is a challenge to kind of actually count up these ballots, because how do you count them? The way how we do this in Germany, Estonia, and also in Kenya is there's one cross on a ballot. Okay, so you can actually pre-sort the ballots into stacks and then just count them. That is, and you know, you can count them, you can recount them, you can count them 10 times, you can kind of draw samples and so on. It's a much easier process. So this is why in the US, actually, technology has been always a part of the electoral process to kind of build up the procedures to actually count ballots correctly. And so what do we have when we have paper ballots? So the paper ballots so far have been the standard of evidence. Of course, paper ballots are not 100% secure, right? There are lots of assumptions also when it comes to paper ballots. They have to be a controlled resource. They need to be stored in secure locations. People have to trust that these locations are actually secure. But if you make all of those assumptions, you actually have a very, very good voter verified paper trail. You have basically a trail of snippets of paper that really reflect the opinions of the voter. And so you can recount them if you want. You can do audits with them. You can challenge them in all different kinds of ways. You can go to a court of electoral disputes and get things audited. There is a process to kind of settle disputes in a good way, because paper ballots actually serve as evidence. And evidence, when you kind of give people the option to check it and to challenge it, generates trust, and trust generates acceptance. And I think that this is actually a really, really good principle. Okay, so we're not talking about the United States here. We're trying to talk about Kenya. And before we actually go there, let me make two observations. The first observation is that when you actually look at the technique of collecting and curating paper ballots, interpreting the paper ballots as evidence and auditing, it's like three corners of a triangle. And in the triangle, there is space. And this space, I think, is like, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a computer scientist, but for me, the space is necessary in order to kind of build a good foundation for people to accept the result of an election. And collection and curation techniques could be optical scanners, it could be the biometric voter register, or it could be a results transition system. All of those things are actually part of how do you collect ballots and how do you collect the result at the end, and how do you make sure that only people voted who are eligible to vote. The evidence then is hand-marked paper ballots or machine-marked paper ballots, but in the United States, there's a lot of people who kind of say, like, the machine-marked paper ballots, they are not so good. They're not so good in the United States because if you have 50 races, how do you check that all of your choices are correctly recorded? That's, of course, a huge challenge, and has been pointed out that actually hand-marked paper ballots are preferred over machine-marked paper ballots. But we also have a disability community who might have problems actually hand-marking paper ballots. And then when we move to internet voting systems, this paper evidence is replaced by other techniques. Zero knowledge proof come to mind. I'm not going to go into any of the technical details here, but there are ways, there are digital signature to sign something, to attribute that the data that you actually receive really is sent from the person or signed by the person whom you think it comes from. And that you can actually achieve with these technical vehicles a good notion of evidence, also when you kind of move into the technical domain. When we think about biometric voter registers, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. How do you actually create evidence that a voter has voted? You might store a fingerprint, but you have to digital sign it. Anyway, evidence is really, really important. And last one is auditing. Now, when you have paper evidence, it's easy to audit. There are risk-limiting audits. Their theory is not easy, but they're really effective of minimizing the amount of work to have to do in order to maximize the confidence creation of it. And yeah, my point is just that these 3 points have to be done. When you move to electronic technology, the auditing part becomes much, much, much more difficult, because an audit, it's easy to convince somebody that when you look at a piece of paper, that this paper is actually the right paper. It's much more easy to convince that person about that than if you have a zero knowledge proof checker where you have to do some cryptographic operation, multiplying and adding numbers in groups that are generated by some crazy generator number, and say like, see, these two numbers are the same. This is why you have to trust it. And so trust really is the result. It's the gold standard that we should all aim for when we actually think about technology. And if it doesn't generate trust, it's problematic. Now, what places of the electoral cycle is actually important? So all things are important. Starting with the legal framework, where you actually kind of define exactly what technology you use. And the legal framework should clearly state what is actually the binding ballot. And if the legal framework has issues, and we will see in Kenya, it actually did have some issues, because the electronic record was suddenly the one that is is binding, and that is challenging. All of the other voter registration, it needs to be trusted. If you don't trust the voter registry, then you can't actually trust that only eligible voter voted. And what happened in Kenya is they actually used a biometric database, and at the beginning, I think it was about 6 months before the election, they noticed that there are almost more voters in the biometric, or there are more records registered in the biometric registry than there are people living in the country. So that clearly there must be duplicates. And so when you go for a biometric voter register, you have to maintain it at all times. It has to be every day. It has to be up to date. That requires processes. These processes need to be created and so on. And then, of course, voting day operations and verification results and post-election activities, they all need to be trusted as well. And we just believe, actually, very often people think, if you talk to laymen on the street, it's like voting day operations is, central to trust generation and verification result, which of course it is, but it is not the only part. So my thesis here basically is that election technologies, they kind of strengthen the collection and the curation of information, of ballots, of results, of voter register, voting cards, or whatever you have, but it actually might weaken evidence collection and the audits. And this is that is something that one has to. This is, I think, that's a thesis, and I'd like to show you a little bit about where the problems come from. And we talk now about the Kenyan case, but I would like to kind of just make sure that we all know that there are processes that could be put in place in order to kind of make sure that this evidence collection and the audits and all of those things actually work well. And that holds for paper-based elections. It holds for internet-based elections, for all kinds of election technologies. Okay, so let me talk about Kenya 2017. It was an eye-opening experience for me. And the reason why it was an eye-opening experience was because when there was an election scheduled for August 8th in 2017, and the election actually took place. And in Kenya, just to kind of give you a little bit of the political background, there are basically two tribes. There are other tribes, but they're really two big tribes, and they have a first past the post system. So whoever gets most of the ballots wins the election and becomes the candidate, becomes the president. And so during the time I was there, these two big groups or tribes basically have two representative parties. One is called Jubilee and the other one is called NASA. And, you know, the one candidate was Uhuru Kenyatta and the other one was Raila Odinga. And so they basically, it's always a challenge between, you know, who is going to win the election. And in the Kenyan election, technology was introduced. And that this kind of technology was actually technology for biometric voter registry. And I just mentioned it and had some challenges. And there was also some challenges when it came to, the other one was digital results transmission, transmitting the results back from the polling stations. And you have to imagine that when you talk about African countries, so I'm not sure if any African, you know, members, if there are listeners from African countries attending this presentation here, but it is a different feeling and a different culture and a little different trust model than, for example, we enjoy in the Western world. So when ballot boxes actually leave polling stations, who knows what happened to them? So it is actually, you know, the idea of using technology in this process was an attempt to actually strengthen the trust in the election outcome and the reports that are actually transmitted from each one of that ballot stations. Now, what happened then was that you know, I hope I don't actually tell you the entire story. Let me just kind of tell you that after the August 8th election, a challenge was filed, and the Supreme Court decided to annul the election and calls for a fresh presidential election, and in part because of problems which had to do with the technology. So that can never be good if an election has to be annulled and a new election has to be called when we talk about trust generation. So, but this is where I came in. So I was actually asked, I joined the Carter Center mission for the fresh election. I have not been for the first election, so I only observed the thing that they tried to fix from the first to the second elections. And so here are some of my observations. Okay, so the first part is that you know, the technology that was actually used was there were devices basically distributed for all polling places all over Kenya, and it was integrated with the existing way of doing results reporting. And there are these forms which are called 34A, 34B, 34C forms, and these forms are on different levels. On, you know, the 34A form were forms, report forms from polling stations. For each polling station actually kind of brought one of, you know, generated one of those forms. And then they were aggregated into 34B forms on the constituency level, of which there were about 90 or a little bit more. I can't remember the exact number. And then in the final place, in the final stage, all of these constituency were in a central location. These forms were then aggregated into a 34C form that actually then contained the binding information of who would become the new president of Kenya. So the BVR and the results transmission system, I said already, were digital. And so when we look at the evidence that is generated, these are, of course, the ballot forms. And it turns out that in the first election, actually, the 30B form, the digital version of it, you know, so maybe I shouldn't kind of, I can't remember exactly which one, but there were digital versions of some of these forms were actually represented, were binding. And so that is actually an important part to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so the data collection, voting station, so people go and vote as we always, as we have seen it on TV many times. There are long lines in front of these polling stations at schools and different public buildings. And on the jurisdiction levels, there were like also in schools or in warehouses, and the ballot, all of this paper material was actually meticulously kept, at least what I could see. It was meticulously kept in boxes and then would stored in these warehouses. Audits, there was basically, for the first election, there was not so much auditing going on because because the way how the data was collected. But on the second, there was actually audits, and these audits tried to kind of collect and compare different versions of the election results. So there were like information on paper, information on Excel files. I'm going to have a slide about exactly how this process worked in just a minute. But the audits actually, turn out to be not super complete. So not everything has been checked. So for example, the mass in the Excel files, which was really, really important in order to sum up the results of the different constituent levels, there was no checking going on about that the mass was actually correct. But the results then at the end became legally binding. Okay, so how did this actually work? So the database was, as I said, the BVR database was not 100%. Was clearly not 100% in, had lots of duplicates in it. And so KPMG was hired in 2017 to kind of remove these duplicates, and they kind of used different way to identify the voters, also with their biometrics, and try to kind of clean it up as much as they could. Then this BVR was actually used to register voter, and the devices that they had were their name was ECePS. Okay, and so that is basically one of these schemes. I got this from a Twitter feed from someone. It's a picture of a ECePS device, and here up in the corner you actually see a fingerprint reader. And so when a voter would vote, they would identify themselves with a fingerprint, and then that fingerprint goes into the system, and then you would actually receive paper ballots, and these paper ballots would then be completed, then finally counted, and then at the end digitally kind of transmitted again. So the question is always in these election situations, who interprets the data that is on these forms, and the forms that are being generated in the polling stations. So anyway, so there is a lot of digital. There is the voting itself is actually on paper, and the result transmission is also digital. So that kind of is an interesting setup, because many countries where elections are challenged is when the ballots are actually digital, and people cannot really reconstruct, what were the ballots that were cast and how do we audit them and so on. Here there are paper ballots, so in theory one could actually audit them, but it turns out when the Supreme Court made its decision, the Supreme Court is forced by law to make a decision within 2 weeks, and you couldn't audit and recount all of the paper ballots. This is why they call it a fresh election. Okay. So moving on. So this was the ECePS, and within 6 months they basically had to procure ECePS devices for all of the, I think, thousands of polling stations. These are many devices. They all needed to be configured, which turned out to be a problem. And they would also used for results transmission. In essence, this was an Android tablet, which also had a camera on the back. And so you could take a picture of the form after it was, transmitted, and or that was to be transmitted. And that form supposedly was also sent by snail mail, so that one can kind of verify that this picture actually is okay. And the staff in the polling station had to kind of type in the numbers for each one of the candidates. And so there was where all of the trouble started. It's like when there was a mistake in the number, it was actually the typed in number that was the binding number and not the number on the form. So one could actually imagine why this is, because there's a certain cultural challenge of people not trusting the paper trail, because somebody might have just added a zero here and there, or made something invalid, or there are different many things how things could go wrong. And so I think the idea was that in the polling station where the people actually filled out the form, the numbers that were recorded are binding. So when the results transmission actually finally happened, many of those so many of these forms were just not scanned. So only numbers were returned without a picture of the number. And so there was not much to verify, digitally at least. And that has actually caused the challenge. But there were also other challenges. And the challenges had to do already with the voter registration. Okay, so because it turns out that when people are hardworking with their fingers, the fingerprint reader that does not identify 100% of all of the voters well. So what happens is, you know, a voter comes in, uses the scheme's device, puts the finger on the fingerprint reader, and then the fingerprint is read, of course. And, you know, it's attempted to kind of look up in the device, in the, you know, the database for all of the voters that were assigned to this polling station. Who could it be? And if yes, then the fingerprint was accepted and you got your ballot papers and fine. But it could also be that it's failed, in which case you had to kind of have your passport with it. And then they would actually try to scan the passport to identify you as a voter. And then you had to give your fingerprint again. And then the idea was, you know, because the system actually knew then which fingerprint, it's much an easier task to kind of, instead of finding a fingerprint among many fingerprints, you just kind of compare a expected fingerprint to the scanned fingerprint. And, you know, if success, then you would actually kind of be okay, and your number would be counted correctly. The last one is then everything is being done manually, and then, you know, if everything fails, yet another form is being filed, but you're still allowed to vote. At the time when these statistics were published, you know, about how many people were fingerprinted and how many, there was a lot of confusion, because the data wasn't entirely clear. People thought like only 40% of the people did this and that. In the press was a lot of discussion about it, how this could be, you know, this is another indication that bad things happened, and that, you know, there was cheating going on in the election, but there was actually, you know, one just had to kind of understand precisely how the process worked to understand what these numbers actually mean. So that is another data point. Here's the long list of all of the steps these numbers have to be going through. So there's the physical ballots on the very left. They're then being recorded in a polling station into a physical form. That is then being digitally scanned and being uploaded using the ECePS device to some servers who, unfortunately, were in France, because the Safran Morpho company was a French company, and they would not let the Kenyan government have access to their servers, which was very kind of problematic in the file, so it could not be audited. That's why I'm talking also about auditing so much. Then those physical forms were kind of sent further to the constitutional level. So that's the constitutional level. And they kind of typed in all of the numbers and made an Excel form out of it. And this is actually where the translation from handwritten numbers into digital representations of those numbers actually happened. That did not happen in the first election. That only happened in the fresh election. In the first election, it was there where the IEBC logo is, where they actually typed in the numbers. And so then these Excel forms would be then printed out and then, you know, scanned again, and then also put into the server. And then finally, you know, when actually the real result was computed, these Excel forms were transmitted on USB sticks, and they were scanned into a huge database. And then out of this database, a physical form was, you know, created, and that was then printed out. And there are these little orange steps here, you know, these lines. These are the lines where actually a lot of verification happened. So, you know, in the constitutional level, they would check that the digital representation of the ballot forms and the physical representation of the ballot form is the same. And it was a lot of effort, took a lot of time. But as you see from the critical path of how these elections actually traveled to the final result, completely irrelevant. And then there were other things, but the Excel sheet was not kind of checked, you know, the math on the Excel sheet was not checked correctly, which was problematic. And what was the result of it? Okay, so the result was, on the one hand side, on October 27, Uhuru Kenyatta became the president-elect. So he's here on the left picture. And in the background, you see all of these offices behind these green awnings. These were the IT offices where all of the results came together. And on the other hand, on the right-hand side, you actually see, you know, people did not accept this. And Odinga already says election systems were hacked, and people started killing each other on the street, and the streets were on fire. Okay, so as an election observer, it was a slightly stressful time, because I'm, you know, it reminded me of my my draft military time at times, where you had a driver who kind of had to avoid your a particular road because there was unrest and people got killed. Okay, here's a quick overview of what actually happened. August 8th, general elections. August 28th, Supreme Court hears the case. September 1st, the Supreme Court says like fresh election has to be filed. And 6 weeks later, about 7 weeks, fresh election takes place in Kenya. And the result of all of this is, Odinga's party said, like, you couldn't organize an election on August 8th, so why can you organize an election on October 26th? We are not participating, we are boycotting this election. So it actually, the use of technology here actually had some real, real impact on the political landscape. Okay, there are many kind of observations that could be made, but if you're interested, read the Carter Center report, and actually tells you all of it. Now, before I close, I wanted to kind of just go back, and my observation was, why don't you actually do a risk limiting audit? Because it's a better way to, it's a really good way to audit ballots. And I actually, the theory of this was by Lindemann and Stark. That goes back to earlier papers, but 2012 is like a paper which is called The Introduction to RLAs, which is very readable, not as statistical, and it's actually kind of good. And so these risk limit audits, I really kind of enjoy them, and they would work a little bit like this. Okay, so these are the results. Here you see a picture of the ballot boxes in the nicely stacked, like all sealed. This is all of the people's votes are in here. The original forms are there, but for the court case on the for the Supreme Court case, nobody looked at those, right? They were sealed, and you can't open them by law, so they're sealed. When they're sealed, they're sealed. But the results would be like Uhuru Kenyatta got about 8,223,000 votes, and Raila Odinga got 6.8 million votes in the first election. Okay, and so there are so many eligible votes, and so you could actually kind of go to Philip Stark's webpage, type in these numbers. Okay, and if I type in a number of a risk limit of 0.1%, okay, I would have to audit, or one would have to audit. So that would be a risk limit of 0.1% means that the election result, that you're 99.9% sure that the election result is valid and is okay. Then you would have to actually audit 166 ballots throughout the entire country. So, instead of, and you would be, so my kind of personal observation is like, why doesn't one do that? Okay, why doesn't one do this? Look at the original paper evidence and kind of look at the 166 ballots. And I think that one of the challenges why one doesn't do it is, first of all, maybe lack of knowledge that this stuff is actually possible, but there might be also extreme, cultural assumptions that have to be satisfied in order for this to work. So some people have to accept the statistics behind it that is really, really complicated. People might be scared by 166 is such a low number. And I've been actually giving presentations to election commissions about the slides, the similar slides like that, adopted to particular national backgrounds, where I said, look at this, there's only 166 ballots. And people always look at me in sheer disbelief. So how can that be? A country where there are 19 million votes, and you look 166, and you're 99.9% sure that Kenyatta won over Odinga. That is a really kind of a strong, strong statement. And we have actually started investigating the trust part of this. And, together with my colleague, Oksana, we looked at, and we asked in the United States, now in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, like, if you would, they actually did risk limited audits for Georgia and for some other states. And I kind of said like, okay, so why don't we just ask the people, what are your expectations? Can we find something which is statistically significant here? And you see, it's a logarithmic scale. The blue dots are for 105 people. We use the Prolific platform to do it, which has its own biases and everything. But 105 people we asked, so there are 105 blue dots here. That's the number of ballots they want to audit. And you see that the top line is 100% of all of the ballots, and 10 means 10% of the ballots, and 0.001% means not very many ballots. And you see that the red, it looks like a hockey stick, right? So these are actually the real numbers that the risk limiting audit would actually propose. And because there is such a discrepancy between the voters' expectations and the real numbers, that might actually be used for disinformation and other things. So I don't think it is a clear answer if risk limiting audits would actually help the Kenyan setting or not, but I think it would be really, really interesting to kind of do studies in this. And now I think my time is basically up. Okay, so I actually said this already, so let me not talk about this too much. But so I believe that there is this triangle which I talked earlier about, like you collect data and you have evidence and you have audits. So I think that this triangle is really kind of central to all of the election thing. And it's a triangle which kind of grows upward because of the complexity of the problems. Collecting evidence is not so difficult that is accepted when you do paper ballots. It's much more difficult when you do digital ballots in internet voting. Auditing is challenging because you need to find ways to kind of conduct audits in such a way that you can communicate that it actually strengthens trust in the election. And then the overall challenge is trust, to kind of make sure that people actually accept the outcome of the election. And going back to my first point, it is like, how do you convince those that lose the election that they should accept it? That actually can only be achieved when you have trust. And with this, I would like to kind of close, and I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carsten. I mean, clearly your talk tells us that trust is becoming more and more the issue that we're talking about, what we're also researching around the use of technology in elections. And it's really a fascinating story that you told us about Kenya. And with that, I'm actually opening up the floor for any questions of our audience. Okay, in case I don't see a question already in the chat, but then maybe, okay, there is one hand. Biao, you want to go first? Maybe you have also an experience from China, or please.
No, I have two very general questions for Professor Schürmann, if I correct your last name correctly.
Yeah, good. Perfect.
And first of all, thank you for your presentation. And e-voting is not my research field, but I'm very interested in proposing two questions. When I'm listening to your presentation, I want to ask a general question of who trusts, because you're talking about the situation in Kenya. But I have checked the e-governance development index in Kenya. It was 0.53 out of 1, even lower than the average world level. So which means, for example, like the provision of online services and telecommunication connection and human capacity is rather lower in Kenya. So I'm wondering if the general population in Kenya have access to this kind of electronic technologies. If of course, if we say, okay, everybody has opportunity to vote via this kind of voting machine or voting online, then we can conclude trust in general population in Kenya. But if some people cannot have access to this kind of electronic technologies, do you talk about the trust just for the people who have access to this kind of electronic technology?
I mean, this universality is really important. Carsten, please.
Yes. So let me try to first. The first part is the elections on paper. So people don't need to have access to technology in order to participate in the process. So that, I think that's a very important statement. The other thing I wanted to add is that there is actually, Kenya is one of the countries where there is a lot of mobile phone use all over the country. So banking, the mobile pay apps were all invented in Kenya. So I think there's a large percentage of people who have access to telephones, but maybe they only use it for banking or for Facebook and for nothing else. So I think among the African countries, Kenya actually enjoys a very higher level than usual when it comes to the use of digital technology, and therefore also kind of possibly you know, an understanding of the processes that are behind. But nevertheless, it's really important to kind of realize that this was a paper election that Kenya made, and was only assisted by technology when it comes to identifying voters and checking their eligibility, and also the task of just transmitting the results, a few numbers from each polling place to a central place, and that did not work at all. I can see that that there's also evidence about the level of trust when it comes to government you know, services. That I think is lower in all of the African countries than it is in the Western world, for example. But you know, this can also have something to do with the political system. So if you have a large tribe who has runs always against a smaller tribe, and you have a first past the post system, it's really not that surprising who is going to win, and that can kind of lead to a lot of frustration. So I think the question, like when you talk about, and I am not a political scientist, and this is just my personal observation, but I think one of the thing is, like, one has to look at it holistically. So technology by itself just doesn't fix it, and it certainly does not fix the trust problem. There are different places where one has to kind of start looking in order to kind of make you know, steps forward.
So also Jan had an interesting observation about the comparison between electronic voting or election technology as well as paper, and he wanted to go about that. Jan, you want to elaborate on your earlier post?
Nice presentation. No, this was just a note. So it was just a note commenting on your statement. That,
I wanted to encourage you to pose it.
Yes, but I actually have a different question. So last year I had the beautiful chance of being an UDIR electronic voting missionaire in Bulgaria. And I can recognize many things that you spoke about, but that's probably the topic on its own. But during the elections, did you also observe like political pressure against machines as such? Was there some media campaign against machines, for example, like all these damn French are actually determining who is going to win and things like that?
Yeah. Okay, that is a very good question. So we, I was of course not responsible. I was only responsible for understanding the technological aspects in that, but that's a very interesting question. And so in order to answer, let me kind of go back to the August 8th, a few days before August 8th. So the in the election observation office of the technical expert was killed 5 days before the election. And when you read newspaper, I do not know if it's true or not, but people claim that that the hand was severed off his body, and it's actually pretty brutal. So there was already in the run-up to the election, there was a lot of coverage about that the IT security expert for the election commission was killed, and you know what happens with his hand. And then later on, there was claims were made that that the credentials were used in log files that were produced that showed actually that these credentials of that person were used, and that was also kind of covered in the press. So, you know, it is really difficult to say. There was a lot of discussion about this in the press, and then when I was there at the end of the election, it was, I think, the soccer final, French against the France against, I've forgotten who they were playing against, but there were actually people were making jokes about the French, that they would not, these are the people who did not allow them access to the servers, because all of the logs and all of the files were all stored on French servers, and it was outside the jurisdiction of Kenya. So I think there are lots of important lessons to be learned So if you ever do this, right, you know, must make sure that you have access to whatever is necessary in the court of dispute. But when it comes to the media coverage, that was extensively covered. And the people making jokes about the French, these were people in a bar, you know, they have nothing to do with elections. So it was a topic of general interest. And I should also say that in Kenya, there are these areas where, you know, one tribe lives and there are other areas where the other tribe lives. So I was in Nairobi, and that is, I think, pretty mixed. You know, who knows what happened when you kind of go to the other centers there. Yeah. I can't hear you, Robert.
Yeah, sometimes you have it on too long, sometimes not. So, William, you have another question, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robert. And Carsten, thanks for a really interesting presentation. I particularly like the notion of the triangle of trust, one of your very first slides. Question I have for you, I wonder whether I might be missing something, but in many southern countries, in Africa in particular, they don't have a process of registering voters. So voters aren't registered, but they turn up to vote, and indelible ink is used on their finger to show that they've cast their vote. And I often wonder whether we go to all this effort to get people registered, and the whole purpose of getting them registered, of course, is to allow them to cast their vote. And I wonder whether I mean, clearly the indelible ink is just a very simple, almost flawless process. And what you're talking about with the use of biometrics in the Kenyan example made me wonder whether, have they gone too complex? Should they just be reverting back to indelible ink? And indeed, should we all be reverting to indelible ink?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I'm afraid that is beyond my, I can't make a recommendation, you know, if we should go back to indelible ink. But I think it is really clear that the technology that was actually introduced in the hope to solve some of the issues of double voting and so on, have actually kind of taken on a life on their own, and they have affected trust even more in this country. I think it's difficult to say because I think these elections were never enjoyed high levels of trust in the first place. So it's difficult to kind of see, you know, if it has worsened the situation or more. But yes, indelible ink is definitely a low-tech technique, and you know, I think so I've observed it in the Egyptian election, where, you know, indelible ink was used extensively, and yes, it also had some challenges, and some of the challenges was actually, you know, what is if you run out of indelible ink? That was actually a critical one. Yes. So what I also wanted to, you know, there was something I wanted to say about these schemes actually that were used for voter registration. They were programmed in such a way that you had to reprogram. I think there were 45,000 of them, and I think you had to reprogram every single one to set it up for the new election. You know, within 6 weeks. So that was a huge challenge, and so the challenges was it's just that was about. You know, results transmission. And at the end, they didn't use that feature at all, but they had to reprogram all of them. So actually maintaining the correctness of a register database with biometrics is extremely complicated. And it is easy to kind of add some fingerprints into a database, but it's really difficult to kind of make sure that there are no duplicates. It is really difficult to kind of make sure that they are updated all the time. And I think there is a huge price to be paid when one actually does it. And I think election EMBs, election management bodies, they sometimes are, you know, they kind of believe the vendor that, you know, you buy a product and it will solve all of their problems because they use technology, and sometimes they don't actually compute in the cost of maintaining the data and the technology while you're doing it. So indelible ink is it has its challenges, but yeah. I don't actually believe that people claimed that were concerned about people double voting so much. So I've seen some evidence of it, but it was only because in the biometric voter register there were some, you know, there's still duplicates left. I mean, you can't a database of 19 million, it's nearly impossible to keep it up to date. If you
William,
don't.
you wanted to follow up?
Oh no, just to say that going back to your case study, Carsten, it was double voting was the reason that they brought in that registration system, but then there were duplicates in the registration system enabling double voting. So it's almost as if it didn't really solve the problem.
I mean, I can also bring in from Armenia there, they also introduced indelible ink, and then basically they forgot to tell the EMB to shake the bottle before they use it. So basically it was disappearing within seconds rather than only after a couple of hours. So actually it was no protection at all. So technology always needs the right instruction, and the proper organizational security. Functional security alone is not enough. Peter, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was a follow-up about the indelible ink, and actually partly Robert has already preempted what I was going to say. I'm sure I've come across stories of that approach being hacked, and Robert just gave an example, but I mean, I think there are other instances where you know, if you scrub your fingers carefully, you can actually largely get rid of it. Or I would guess that the tricks like sort of dipping your index finger in Vaseline or something beforehand would probably make it easier to get rid of the ink after. But also, perhaps more importantly, I mean, if you're concerned about forced abstention type attacks, this is wide open. Was it in Afghanistan or something that the Taliban was threatening to, if they found anyone with a stained finger, they'd cut the finger off or whatever. So if you're concerned about forced abstention, it's not the solution. So you know, every technology has its problems.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That was that's absolutely right.
Okay. Do we have other questions? If not, then I would be interested in how do you actually see the trust now that basically technology as an independent third party is actually not helping to establish trust? So how do we get people to trust an election other than through statistical means, for example?
So this is another very broad question to which it's impossible to have an answer to, because if we had the answer, we would just
many answers.
Many answers. No, I actually believe that the political system and the way how elections, you know, the electoral system in the background, first past the post, might actually be, you know, and that actually the reason why the system is the way it is. It's from the British Times that actually kind of installed that rule. So I think it's technology is not the answer, but I think, as I said earlier, it has to kind of look at the political system as well.
I could imagine that David actually would have an interesting question around the idea of distrust as a concept. David.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the place where to raise my hand. Hi, Carsten. Happy to see you after a long time.
Hi, David.
That's one thing that it's interesting me, and that chokes me a bit on the case that you explain, is that the technological measure that was introduced was aiming to build trust, but paradoxically it had the opposite effect, and somehow it built distrust on the people and was the root of the discussion on whether the system was working or not, or the elections were trustworthy or not. And that's interesting. I mean, I'm making a research in which I'm trying to include the dimension of distrust. And my question would be, how would you put this concept of distrust in the thing that you're analyzing, or in the case that you're presenting?
Yes. Okay. This is yet another very, very good question.
Yeah.
It's basically the negative, you know, what is minus trust? How do you talk about distrust? So again, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know how to kind of think about distrust. I know in certain societies are built upon distrust, and the challenge in South America, the challenge is to actually run an election in a distrusted environment in such a way that people actually accept the outcome, but they start off with zero trust. Here it's a lot of trust when we talk about Denmark, where I am right now. It's a lot of trust in the system, and it's the opposite. So I'm not sure how to kind of talk about distrust in that setting, but I can only tell you that after this election and Kenyatta became president, there was the famous handshake. So Odinga and Kenyatta kind of came together and shook hands that they will be working together. And so that my last trip to Kenya was in 2018, where there was a completely different feeling on the street. Nobody was killed. There was a acceptance and happiness, as I can't describe it in any other way. So I believe that also those who after an election takes place and new governments are installed, the way how they behave afterwards, how inclusive they are, is a really important part. I talk about trust and distrust in this setting, but I don't have a better answer than that. I'm sorry.
Well, fair enough. I think it's an interesting element that you bring, that how the political situation and the political behavior afterwards can help to solve a problem that might be, I mean, that's raised because of the questioning of the election outcomes and so on. So I think that's a good approach.
Yes, but now of course you got rid of the opposition by forming the